Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're talking about why your constipation diet might be making your IBS-C worse. I feel like constipation is one of the most oversimplified digestive symptoms on the internet. Everyone says the same things. Eat more fiber, drink more water, take magnesium, try probiotics, cut out gluten, go low FODMAP. And meanwhile, there are people out there doing all of those things and somehow still feeling bloated, backed up, uncomfortable, reactive to foods, and honestly, sometimes even worse, the harder they try to, quote, eat healthy. I immediately think of one woman we worked with who carried chia seed packets, probiotics, magnesium gummies, and fiber bars everywhere she went because she was so determined to fix her constipation naturally. She was eating oatmeal with flax every morning, big salads every day, tons of vegetables, constantly researching gut health online, trying all the supplements. And instead of getting better, she progressively got more bloated and distended throughout the day to the point where she started dreading meals because by the evening she looked genuinely 6 months pregnant. And this is where the IBS-C conversation gets really confusing and frustrating for people because a lot of people with constipation are not lazy about their health. They are trying incredibly hard. Sometimes they are trying harder than anyone else around them. They're researching constantly, trying supplement after supplement, trying to heal naturally and still not feeling better. And part of the problem is that constipation is often way more nuanced than simply you need to eat more fiber. Constipation can involve things like slowed motility, microbial fermentation, methane gas, nervous system dysregulation, gut brain dysfunction, pelvic floor dysfunction, food intolerances, and digestive hypersensitivity, which means the answer is not always just throwing more roughage, more restriction, or more supplements into an already overwhelmed digestive system. In fact, for some people, constantly trying to force more fiber into a gut that is already bloated, fermenting excessively, or moving too slowly can actually make symptoms significantly worse. So, in today's episode, I want to walk you through why constipation and bloating are often so connected, why some healthy foods can backfire for IBS-C, why fiber helps some people but makes other people feel dramatically worse, and why things like motility, fermentation, methane gas, and even the nervous system often play a much bigger role than people realize. Because once you start understanding what's actually driving the constipation underneath, the whole conversation starts making a lot more sense. And because I know a lot of people listening are probably wondering, okay, but what do I actually eat if my gut reacts to everything? I also put together a really practical diet guide with a gentle, lower fermentation, lower FODMAP meal plan with supportive fiber ideas for sensitive digestion, meal and snack ideas, and a list of foods that commonly worsen bloating and constipation. So I'll make sure that we link to that for you in the show notes as well. So let's start by just reframing or just grounding ourselves in what is IBS-C. IBS-C stands for irritable bowel syndrome with constipation. So, in simple terms, it means constipation is the main bowel pattern someone experiences with IBS, but it usually comes with more than just difficulty going to the bathroom. People with IBS-C may have hard stools, infrequent bowel movements, straining, or that feeling that you're just not getting it all out. We call that incomplete evacuation. Bloating is also extremely common, and many people feel full, heavy, or uncomfortable after eating even normal sized meals. Clinically, IBS-C is typically diagnosed based on symptom patterns called the Rome criteria, which include constipation, abdominal pain or discomfort, and changes in bowel habits. One of the biggest misunderstandings about IBS-C is that it is only a stool problem, when in reality, it often involves a breakdown in communication between the gut, the nervous system, the digestive muscles, and the microbiome. The gut may not be moving food through efficiently. The nerves in the gut may be overly sensitive. The muscles involved in elimination may not be coordinating well, or the pelvic floor muscles may have difficulty properly relaxing during bowel movements. All of these things can contribute to constipation, straining, and incomplete evacuation. So when someone says they have IBS-C, we're not just thinking they need more fiber. We are thinking, what is causing the system to slow down, feel irritated, and stop communicating properly? And that is where the conversation around digestion, motility, the nervous system, fermentation, and diet becomes a lot more nuanced. So let's talk about why constipation and bloating often happen together. A lot of people think of constipation and bloating as two separate problems, but in reality, they're often very connected. When stool is moving too slowly through the digestive tract, food and waste sit in the gut longer than they're supposed to. And the longer things sit, the more opportunity there is for fermentation to occur. And as fermentation increases, gas starts building up in the intestines, which can create pressure, distension, discomfort, and just feeling that heavy feeling in your stomach. And that's why some people feel like they wake up relatively flat in the morning, but look progressively more bloated as the day goes on and fermentation is building up. Food keeps coming in, gas keeps building, but things are not moving through efficiently downstream. One important nuance here is that constipation is not always just a simple mechanical slow gut issue. Sometimes constipation is primarily driven by slowed motility or difficulty with movement through the digestive tract, yes, but sometimes the fermentation itself is part of what is slowing things down in the first place. So in some cases, certain gases produced by gut microbes, particularly methane, can actually contribute to slower intestinal movement. So the issue is not always just, oh, there's more gas, but sometimes the gas that's being produced itself is actively contributing to the slowed motility and therefore the constipation, kind of like a vicious cycle. And this is something we see a lot with methane dominant small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is also referred to as EMO, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which we're going to discuss more throughout this episode. And I also have a few detailed methane SIBO specific episodes that we're going to link into the show notes for those wanting to dive deeper into that piece of the constipation conversation. So now let's talk about fiber and why fiber is a double-edged sword with constipation. Because this is one of the first things we think about and that we're told when we struggle with constipation is eat more fiber. And to be fair, fiber can absolutely be helpful for people. Certain types of fiber support stool bulk, water retention in the stool, and movement through the digestive tract. But this is also where the IBS conversation starts getting a lot more nuanced because fiber is not one single thing. And more fiber is not always better. So the fiber conversation is widely oversimplified. The reality is there are different types of fiber and they behave very differently in the gut. Soluble fiber absorbs water and forms a gel-like consistency, which can help to kind of form the stool. Insoluble fiber tends to add more bulk and roughage. And then there are fermentable fibers, which are broken down by gut bacteria, and those can produce gas as a byproduct of fermentation. So for someone with a relatively healthy digestive system and pretty normal motility, that fermentation may not be a big issue. But if food and stool are already moving too slowly through the digestive tract, adding large amounts of fermentable material can sometimes make symptoms significantly worse. And by fermentable, we're talking about high FODMAP foods in largely. And this is where a lot of people with IBS-C get stuck because they start loading up on big salads, oatmeal, bran cereal, flaxseed, chia seed, raw vegetables, and fiber supplements because they've been told fiber is always the answer to constipation. And then instead of feeling better, they become more bloated, more uncomfortable, more distended, and sometimes even more constipated. One of the easiest ways to think about this is like a traffic jam. If traffic on the highway is already backed up, adding more cars to the road does not necessarily solve the problem. In many cases, it just creates more congestion. The same thing can happen in the digestive tract when motility is sluggish and large amounts of fermentable fiber are constantly being added on top of that slowdown. So, what we want to do is not just have a low fiber diet, but a smarter and more individualized approach to fiber, depending on what the gut can currently tolerate. So this becomes especially relevant in methane dominant SIBO or EMO. The methane gas itself has been associated with slower intestinal movement. So for some people, the issue is not just too much gas, as we mentioned earlier, it's the fermentation process itself that is contributing to the constipation. And that is part of why some people feel dramatically worse with the more fermentable material that they eat, because they're unknowingly fueling that fermentation pattern that's contributing to the bloating and the pressure and the slower movement throughout the digestive tract. And I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who were trying so hard to eat healthy and were unintentionally making themselves miserable in the process. This is why blanket nutrition advice online can be so frustrating for people, because someone can be eating objectively healthy on paper and still feel terrible in their gut. I think about one client where she was loading up on fiber, eating oatmeal, flax, and berries for breakfast, big salads for lunch, large portions like vegetable grain bowls at night. She was taking psyllium husk at night. And instead of feeling better, she was getting more distended and uncomfortable throughout the day, to the point where she stopped wanting to go out to restaurants and social events because she constantly looked bloated, and because of how she felt and how she looked bloated by the end of the day. So this is a great example that we see all the time of this problem. The right foods for you, if you have IBS-C, depend largely on the cause of your constipation. So this is where we get into the conversation of root causes. And this is where it can get confusing if you're just searching for solutions online, because if you search best constipation foods, you'll usually get one giant generic list of foods everyone is supposed to eat more of. But in real life, IBS-C is often much more nuanced than that. Some people genuinely do feel better with more fiber and fruit and hydration and foods that help to soften the stool, especially when constipation is more related to low fiber, standard American diet that's low in fiber, high in refined carbs. Maybe dehydration is there, inconsistent eating habits, or just a low quality diet. So for that person, working more fiber into their diet may be a big help, may be exactly what they need. However, other people feel dramatically worse with those same strategies because maybe their gut is already dealing with excessive fermentation, slowed motility, methanogen overgrowth, significant bloating. So this is why the right diet depends heavily on why constipation is happening in the first place. And so we don't want to just give generic advice. We want to understand what the gut can currently tolerate and what may actually support motility and bowel regularity for each specific person. In the guide that I mentioned earlier that we have in the show notes, it's doing a few different jobs. It's giving a list of foods that have fiber in a gentle form to help those of you who have difficulty tolerating fiber or may even have a methane picture going on. So it is designed for the person who has digestive issues, who has IBS-C. Foods that commonly worsen bloating and pressure in sensitive guts can include, so we're going to talk about the fermentable foods right now, include large amounts of garlic and onion, certain beans and legumes, large servings of wheat products, sugar alcohols like xylitol or erythritol, heavily processed high fiber foods, big salads and grain bowls and veggie seed bowls, and excessive amounts of roughage. So things like that. And many of these foods are high FODMAP. FODMAPs are fermentable carbohydrates that can cause lots of gas production in people who have microbial imbalances in their gut. So that does not mean these foods are bad or need to be avoided forever. It could just be more about what your gut can comfortably tolerate right now based on what's happening underneath the surface. So, one of the biggest mistakes I see people with IBS-C make is swinging between extremes. They either start eating large amounts of roughage and fiber, trying to fix their constipation, or they become so afraid of bloating and discomfort that they barely eat enough to support digestion properly at all. Usually, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. For many people with IBS-C, especially those dealing with bloating or slowed motility, a gentler and more balanced approach to meals often feels much better than extremes in either direction. So that often means cooked vegetables instead of giant raw salads, moderate portions of fermentable foods instead of very large amounts, softer or blended fibers instead of excessive raw roughage, balanced meals instead of extremes, and regular nourishment and hydration throughout the day. So, an example of what that might look like. Let's talk about breakfast, starting the day with something warm and easier to digest instead of immediately overwhelming the gut with a giant high fiber breakfast. And I know we typically don't eat a giant breakfast, but certainly breakfast is somewhere where you could really load up on fiber. And instead, we want to be more gentle with it. So we want to have oatmeal in portions you tolerate, maybe eggs with cooked vegetables, a balanced smoothie where maybe you have fruits, and you could even throw some leafy greens or maybe even some chia seeds in there, but it's blended and the chia seeds are soak in there. You could leave it for a few minutes so they can absorb the water. So that helps the fiber be easier to digest and tolerate. Or maybe just toast with nut butter and some tolerated soft fruit on the side, like bananas or melons. Lunch and dinner, many people with IBS-C feel better with balanced cooked meals that feel nourishing and satisfying without being excessively heavy or difficult to digest. So, examples would be cooked vegetables instead of big raw salads if bloating is severe, making sure you have adequate protein, tolerated carbohydrates, things like rice, potatoes, oats, or breads and grains. Could have some whole grain in them or could be like sourdough, healthy fats, moderate portions instead of extremely large meals, and hydration, just staying hydrated throughout the day. So, snacks can be helpful because many people with IBS-C do better with regular nourishment throughout the day rather than swinging between undereating and very large meals. So, snacks can be a helpful opportunity to incorporate supportive fibers in forms that may feel easier for the gut to tolerate. So, things like chia pudding or chia seeds mixed into yogurt, oatmeal again, smoothies with blended fruit and other fiber sources, maybe brown rice cakes with banana and almond butter, and just softer fruits like bananas, kiwis, berries, or even cooked fruit if tolerated. So, smaller amounts of fiber spread throughout the day generally feel much more manageable for sensitive digestive systems than trying to force huge amounts of roughage in one meal. And importantly, this should not feel like a cleanse or a restrictive diet or a perfect food plan or a long list of foods to be afraid of. What we're looking for is just reducing digestive overwhelm, improving tolerability, supporting motility, and creating a calmer digestive environment overall, not following a perfect or ultra restrictive diet. All right. And then let's talk about some hidden contributors that can worsen constipation because sometimes constipation is not just about food. Certain medications, supplements, and even some well-intentioned health habits can unintentionally slow digestion down further or make stools harder or more difficult to pass. Some of the more common contributors that we see include iron supplements, calcium supplements, certain antacids, opioid medications, some antidepressants, excessive use of binders or heavily binding supplements like activated charcoal or clay-based products, chronically undereating, or overly restrictive diet patterns. And this is important because many people don't realize that these things can quietly contribute to constipation over time. For example, Someone may start taking iron and calcium and binders or multiple constipating supplements without realizing that can sometimes contribute to harder stools or slower motility. And some of these things, a lot of times we see people taking things like binders for bloating symptoms or stomach upset, not realizing it's feeding into worsening the problem. So we also see this happening with overly restrictive diets. Sometimes people become so focused on avoiding symptoms that they unintentionally stop eating enough overall food, hydration, fiber, or variety in their diet to properly support motility and regular bowel movements. So does not mean to abruptly stop important supplements if you're taking something like iron for medical reasons, but it does mean that constipation often has multiple contributing factors, and sometimes the things we're using to try to help can unintentionally become part of the picture as well. So that would just be a conversation to have with your doctor if you're unsure. Let's talk about some supportive strategies to help IBS-C. And this is beyond just the diet conversation, because while constipation often requires a deeper look at root causes, there might be some simple supportive strategies that can help improve motility, help you feel better, and decrease digestive overwhelm. Let's talk about some things that can help you feel better, can help you move your bowels. And these strategies, I will say, they usually work best when they're done consistently and moving into them gradually versus aggressively. And very often they work better in combination, so doing more than just one thing. So the first one is hydration. Hydration matters more than many people realize when it comes to stool consistency and bowel movements. When the body is dehydrated, the colon pulls more water out of the stool, and that can make the bowel movements harder and more difficult to pass. I just love the example because I always think of it. If you've ever mixed up your fiber supplement and not added enough water and then let it sit there for a second, what happens? It turns into this thick paste. And that happens in our guts when there is plenty of fiber, but not enough hydration. Some people also find it helpful to start the morning with some warm fluids. If you have trouble drinking enough water throughout the day because you get busy, you don't have access to it, you don't have it with you, forget, starting your day with some warm fluids rather than rushing straight into your coffee or straight into your stressful day can really give you a jump start. So you might just take some warm water or tea and slowly sip it first thing in the morning to give yourself that head start. And that can also stimulate that gastrocolic reflex. It can help stimulate a bowel movement by starting to stimulate digestive activity. Another thing is gentle movement. Movement, I can't tell you how many times that a client will tell me that movement helps them have a bowel movement. So moving your body helps to stimulate motility, both mechanically, just directly moving that space around as you're moving your body, but also movement stimulates blood flow to the digestive tract. So it encourages muscle contractions through the intestines and also just physically, mechanically helps move gas and stool through. And that's one of the recommendations people sometimes dismiss because it sounds overly simplified, but honestly, it can genuinely make a noticeable difference. I just had a client tell me that again yesterday. That movement is one of the best ways for her to have a bowel movement is to go for a walk or go for a run. And for some people, it might look like just walking after meals. We're even talking about gentle exercise like stretching, mobility work, and just also reducing long periods of sitting throughout the day, especially if you notice digestion feels especially slow and sluggish during travel or desk work or just sedentary periods. Even just getting up and stretching and walking for a few minutes can make a big difference. And you could take what was trending on TikTok recently, what they call a fart walk, which is when you walk after meals to release your trapped gas. Just make sure nobody's walking directly behind you. Now, the next thing is meal regularity. The digestive tract often responds surprisingly well to consistency. If you're skipping meals, if you're grazing erratically, if you're eating really late at night or swinging between undereating and overeating, All of those things can make digestive symptoms feel even more chaotic and irregular. And one reason for that is that eating itself helps stimulate digestive signaling and motility throughout the digestive tract, keeping things moving. So, this is why some people notice they become more constipated during periods of chronic dieting or high stress or busy schedules or travel. And this is why balanced meals eaten more consistently throughout the day can sometimes help create more predictable bowel movements. And interestingly, many people with IBS-C feel their digestion works better when mornings become less rushed. Even something as simple as sitting down to eat breakfast consistently instead of immediately rushing into stress and caffeine and chaos can make more of a difference than you might expect over time. And that was actually a huge piece for me as well, because I was constipation predominant for many years. And when I think about it, since I was 14 years old, I used to run cross country. I would wake up and run at 5 in the morning. And throughout much of my 20s and 30s, that was the way. And I live here in Arizona, where for 6 months out of the year, if you don't get your run finished by 6 or 6:30 a.m., it's too hot. So I would get up and go straight into running. Well, that did nothing for calming my nervous system or allowing me to ease into my day and have a bowel movement. And then I would come home, rush, get ready, commute, a long commute to work for many years, and rush, have a busy work day, come home. So no wonder I was constipated, because my nervous system was always in fight or flight, and it was never relaxed enough to allow that motility. Another thing is toilet positioning and bowel habits. Sometimes even simple mechanical changes can make bowel movements feel noticeably easier and more complete. So, for example, allowing enough time to fully relax during bowel movements. So, not just going in there and giving yourself a few seconds, but really spending some time relaxing on the toilet. Not a lot of time. I'm not talking about a half an hour. Not constantly ignoring the urge to go. That's a big one. We do this a lot because we have to sometimes, but you want to allow some time in the morning so that you can follow that urge. And then creating a more consistent bathroom routine, having a certain time or kind of around a certain time that you go in there and allow yourself the opportunity to go. And also improving toilet positioning. So one thing I personally love is my squatty potty, which I don't have an affiliate relationship with. I just love my squatty potty, which you can get on Amazon. But whether you use that or you use just something else to put your feet on, a little stool of some sort, elevating the feet changes the angle of the pelvis and rectum in a way that can help reduce straining and support a more complete bowel movement. So if you don't know what that is, it's a little stool a few inches off the ground that you put your feet up on while you're sitting on the toilet. In fact, in many parts of the world, squatting style toilet positioning is still much more common, and the body is naturally placed into a posture that can make bowel movements easier to pass mechanically. If you don't have a squatty potty or you don't want to purchase one, even a small footstool under your feet can give you a similar effect. The next supportive thing I highly recommend is certain forms of magnesium. Now, magnesium can go either way. Certain forms of magnesium are really well absorbed, meaning they get into the bloodstream and throughout the body, and they actually help with all kinds of things for your health. But the type of magnesium I'm talking about are forms that are not well absorbed. They don't go easily into the bloodstream, and therefore it's a heavy mineral that stays in the digestive tract, which means it draws water into the digestive tract osmotically, and that helps us pass a bowel movement. So the forms that specifically are helpful for this are magnesium citrate and magnesium oxide. Those are the ones you would use intentionally for bowel support. And I think this is an area where people sometimes give up too quickly, because a lot of people know this already, but they'll try a small dose, the labeled dose for a day or two, and then say, oh, it didn't work. When in reality, the amount needed for more significant constipation is often much higher than the label dose. So I usually recommend increasing gradually and giving each dose a few days before increasing again, because there can be a lag time in seeing how effective a particular dose is going to be. And that gradual approach matters though, because increasing too aggressively can easily overshoot the mark and then create the opposite problem. I would check with your doctor first if you're going to use magnesium this way, just to make sure you don't have. There are certain health conditions where you wouldn't want to do that. So I would double check with your doctor first. But if constipation is a big part of your picture, this might be something to try. And if someone is dealing with significant motility dysfunction or a methane related constipation, magnesium alone may only partially help because it may not address the deeper reason the gut is slowing down in the first place. So I'm sharing these supportive strategies with you so you have a way to get relief, but we still want to look at the root cause of why you're having the problem so you're not just relying on something like high doses of magnesium as your end all be all solution. It should be a step in your journey, not the end of the road. Next, let's talk a little bit more about the nervous system and IBS-C because this part gets overlooked constantly. And I kind of touched on this earlier when I told you my story about getting up, running at 5 in the morning, and then just rushing through my day. So a lot of people think that constipation is purely a food thing, but digestion is very heavily connected to the brain and the nervous system as well. And this connection is often referred to as the gut-brain axis, and it plays such a major role in these things like motility, digestion, sensitivity, and your bowel habits. When your body perceives stress, it shifts into a fight or flight state. We call it the sympathetic state. In that state, digestion is not a priority. Blood flow and energy get directed towards survival functions instead, and the digestive tract often slows down in the process. It gets deprioritized. So, for a lot of people, that can show up as slow motility, constipation, bloating, increased abdominal tension, and just feeling like digestion completely changes, maybe during periods of stress or travel, anxiety or overwhelm. And this actually was such a huge part of my story with chronic constipation and even my acid reflux. So for me, the issue was not needing more fiber. I actually ate a lot of fiber at the time. My nervous system was heavily involved, and stress was having a real impact on how my digestive tract was moving. There was just very little space for my nervous system to actually slow down enough for digestion and motility to function properly. Over time, doing more nervous system and gut brain work became one of the biggest game changers for me, not just in improving my acid reflux. So, first, that's what improved because I learned that stress was the biggest driver of my acid reflux, but I was still dealing with the constipation. And I was still pretty busy with my routine. So I had learned kind of how to deal with my stress better from moment to moment, but I hadn't changed my routine. I was still super busy. And then later in my journey, actually just a few years ago, I started incorporating vagus nerve stimulation support. And that I feel changed the game for me. It made a surprising difference in my constipation and motility. Chronic constipation is honestly something I don't deal with anymore. And it still amazes me considering how much it used to be a part of my life. This is something I see with clients all the time too. I think people sometimes dismiss the gut brain connection because it can sound vague or overly mind body, especially when you've been told, oh, it's just stress. And that makes a lot of people feel dismissed or just brushed off. And what we're saying here is it is just stress, but it's a big deal. Chronic stress is actually having a physical effect that is now the default for your body. So when you have had chronic stress or anything affecting the gut brain connection, any type of stress on the body, your nervous system gets used to being in fight or flight as its default. So even when I decreased my stress. I was able to manage it better from moment to moment. My nervous system was still in fight or flight most of the time. So for me, I noticed that the vagus nerve stimulation really made the difference. And I did it for a few months, but I don't do it anymore and I'm still good. So anyway, I'm not saying that's going to be the solution for everyone. Again, what we're saying in this conversation is there are multiple factors that contribute to IBS-C, and the solution's going to depend for each person on what their root cause is. And also, just a reminder, it's usually a combination of some of these things that are going to make the difference. Other things, okay, so vagus nerve stimulation is one thing, but you don't need to do that per se. There are other ways to support relaxing your nervous system. There are actually so many ways. Some of the ones that we share that we use with our clients: diaphragmatic breathing, slowing down during meals, even diaphragmatic breathing prior to each meal, gut directed hypnotherapy, that's a big one, general stress reduction practices. I love the breathing because it's such an easy, free, quick, practical thing you can do anywhere, anytime. That's always a tool we have access to. All right. When IBS-C might actually be methane SIBO. This part is such a big conversation. And as I mentioned, we have many other resources and episodes about this. So I'm not going to take a deep dive here, but we can't have a constipation about IBS-C without talking about methane SIBO, because it is one of the biggest drivers of chronic constipation that I see in my practice. And I've been seeing that for over 10 years now. So this methane SIBO is one of the major reasons people continue struggling. And most people, a lot of people out there don't know that's what's going on. They just know that they're constipated. So a lot of people continue struggling with constipation despite fiber, hydration, probiotics, elimination diets, healthy eating, because methane overgrowth is actually the underlying issue. So what happens is you have an overgrowth of certain microbes in the gut, and that overgrowth produces methane gas, and sometimes very large amounts of methane gas, but even small amounts of overgrowth can significantly slow your motility. So this gas becomes a vicious cycle where the gas itself is bloating you, but then the gas is further slowing motility, which is further backing up that traffic jam, which is trapping the gas, which is making you even more bloated. So, some hints or red flags to alert you that you might be dealing with methane SIBO would be constipation, bloating, feeling overly full even after normal sized meals, feeling like gas is trapped, incomplete evacuation. Maybe you're not constipated, but maybe you pass stool every day, but it's just a little bit. You don't feel like you're getting it all out. Increased food intolerances, and just feeling like food is just sitting there. We can also see more upper GI symptoms because the methane gas can also slow stomach emptying. So we can see symptoms like acid reflux or even nausea. And this is why some people feel like no matter how much water or fiber or healthy food they eat, they're still backed up. And in fact, another clue that you may have methane SIBO is the more fiber you eat, the more healthy foods you eat, the more bloated and backed up you are. For so many people, this is the missing piece that makes standard constipation advice feel ineffective or even counterproductive. If you suspect this may be part of the picture for you, I would definitely check out our resources. We have resources, we have blog posts, YouTube videos, and podcast episodes, and a methane SIBO diet plan. So that might be a good starting point. You need to be tested, and that's something you can request from your doctor, or we take care of that if we're working with you as our client. But the key, I guess, is that methane SIBO is something that's treatable, and it doesn't have to be something you live with forever once you realize that's what's going on and that's your root cause. So, why does IBS-C require a more individualized approach? Everybody's different. For one person, fiber might be a game changer, while for somebody else, it makes them feel dramatically worse. One person might improve just by making sure they drink enough water or eat regular meals. For another person, they have significant methane overgrowth, nervous system dysregulation, or even maybe deeper motility dysfunction under the surface. And all of these experiences are real. And this is why IBS-C often becomes much more nuanced than simply following one generic food list or endlessly layering in more supplements, more probiotics, more food restrictions, or more gut hacks on top of each other. In our practice at Nutrition Resolution, we're a group of GI focused functional dietitians and nutritionists, and our philosophy is very rooted in understanding why symptoms are happening in the first place rather than just chasing the symptoms themselves. Whether your biggest issue is fermentation or methane production or nervous system or gut brain axis, whether you need more motility support or other people might be unknowingly overwhelming their already sluggish digestion with too much roughage or restriction or digestive stress. So that is when a more individualized, food-friendly, root-cause focused approach to IBS-C is needed. So our goal is not creating a more restrictive diet or endlessly trying just random strategies. We want to identify what's going on with each particular person and then put together a clear plan toward getting better. We actually do have a visual breakdown of our general framework of the work that we do with clients, and we're going to link to that as well in the show notes. So, final thoughts on this topic. If there is one thing I really hope you take away from today's episode, it is that IBS-C is often so much more nuanced than people are led to believe. For many people, the issue is not simply you need more fiber. Constipation can involve motility, fermentation, methane gas, the nervous system, food intolerances, muscle coordination, digestive signaling, all interacting together at the same time. And honestly, I think this is one of the biggest reasons so many people end up feeling frustrated and defeated around their digestion. They feel like they are trying so hard to do everything right, but the advice they're following is often way too oversimplified for what is actually happening underneath the surface. Sometimes the issue is not that you have failed at gut health. Sometimes the approach itself has simply been missing important pieces of the puzzle. And the great news is once you start understanding the bigger picture, things start to make a lot more sense, and the process can begin feeling less like a random trial and error and more like building a clearer, more targeted strategy around what your digestive system actually needs. And that can be an incredible relief for people who have spent years feeling confused, reacting to everything, or stuck in this constant cycle of trying more and more things without understanding why they're not working. So if you want to learn more about the root cause side of IBS-C, bloating, methane overgrowth, motility, and why so many people stay stuck trying so many different strategies, I'm also going to link to a free masterclass that I think would be really helpful. It's called Why Your Gut Still Isn't Better, the real reasons you feel stuck and what to do about it. And it walks you through the bigger picture framework of how we address gut work in more complex digestive cases and what that process actually looks like. And if you're interested in working together, you can also schedule a strategy call with our team, and we'll link to that in our show notes as well. As always, thank you so much for being here and listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.